Welcome to all. We are very pleased to welcome you to the conference organized by our colleague Aurore Laget-Annamayer. This conference is supported by CR2D and Governance and Regulation Chair. This conference is held in English and French. This is a first for a law conference. Congratulations to Aurore. Many thanks to the translators and to the company pour parler. Now, I am switching to French. Le Centre de recherche droit à Dauphine, le CR2D, développe des recherches en droit économique et notamment en droit de la régulation économique. À ces recherches est adossé un master, le master droit et régulation des marchés, qui est ouvert à l'alternance. Les opérateurs de transport ferroviaire accueillent régulièrement nos étudiants en alternance et nous les en remercions vivement. Les étudiants du master vous ont accueillis ce matin et vous accompagneront tout au long de la journée. Le colloque qui nous réunit aujourd'hui est le volet d'un diptyque consacré à l'ouverture de la concurrence du transport ferroviaire, conçu et réalisé par le professeur Aurore Laget-Annamayer. Le premier volet, consacré au cas français, nous avait réunis au printemps 2021 à l'université de Rouen. Et j'ai le plaisir de retrouver dans cette enceinte quelques-uns des intervenants à ce colloque qui avaient suscité un grand enthousiasme. À l'issue de ce colloque ensoleillé et réjouissant, était né le projet d'élargir la réflexion à l'Europe dans un colloque de droit comparé. Depuis, Aurore nous a rejoints à Dauphine et nous sommes heureux de l'avoir accompagnée dans la réalisation de ce beau projet. Nous sommes honorés et ravis, grâce à son travail, d'accueillir les régulateurs, les opérateurs du secteur ferroviaire, des représentants de la Commission européenne et des universitaires qui étudient les secteurs régulés. Malgré l'aide de la chaire Gouvernance et Régulation, dirigée par notre collègue, le professeur Éric Brousseau, qui va nous rejoindre dans un instant, nous avons dû nous limiter à l'étude de quelques pays européens, le Royaume-Uni, l'Italie, l'Espagne, l'Autriche et l'Allemagne. Alors, à ces pays choisis pour leur exemplarité du système adopté, d'autres auraient pu être ajoutés et nous espérons qu'ils le seront dans la publication qui suivra ce colloque. Alors, ces derniers mois, le débat s'est surtout focalisé sur le fonctionnement du marché de l'électricité. Et au demeurant, ce marché européen de l'électricité n'a pas dysfonctionné, en ce sens qu'il a continué à permettre la formation des prix et des échanges entre les États membres grâce aux règles de marché et grâce aux interconnexions européennes. Toutefois, on le sait, les prix formés par le marché sont difficilement soutenables pour des consommateurs qui n'ont sans doute pas suffisamment été bien préparés au fonctionnement concurrentiel d'un marché. C'est la raison pour laquelle, vous le savez, on s'engage dans la réforme du market design. Alors, qu'en est-il dans le secteur ferroviaire et plus spécialement le transport de voyageurs ? Si l'on s'en tient au cas français, en décembre 2020, la SNCF a perdu le monopole sur les lignes à grande vitesse. Depuis, Trenitalia a investi la ligne Paris-Lyon-Milan. Alors, quelles sont les conséquences de ce duopole ? Conformément à l'analyse classique de la concurrence, il semble que l'arrivée de cet opérateur a eu des conséquences positives. Première, c'est que les tarifs ont été contenus alors que les coûts d'exploitation ont augmenté. Et puis la deuxième, c'est que les deux opérateurs présentent un taux de remplissage, je crois, très satisfaisant. Donc la concurrence ne sanctionne pas nécessairement l'ancien monopole si celui-ci adapte ses prix et ses services. Mais le développement des nouveaux acteurs est long sur ce marché. D'une part, l'exploitation ferroviaire est une industrie à coût fixe élevé, et d'autre part, les péages demandés par le gestionnaire du réseau semblent élevés, ce qui relève inévitablement le seuil de rentabilité des nouveaux entrants. En France, donc, la concurrence se déploie lentement, mais nous espérons qu'elle saura permettre la conjugaison des enjeux économiques, sociaux et environnementaux. Et nul doute que les échanges de ce jour nous permettront d'enrichir notre analyse des effets de l'ouverture régulée à la concurrence du transport ferroviaire grâce à l'indispensable éclairage de droit comparé. Et tout en remerciant l'équipe de la chaire Gouvernance et Régulation et du CR2D pour leur soutien, je passe la parole au professeur Éric Brousseau qui dirige la chaire Gouvernance et Régulation.
Merci beaucoup Claudie, merci beaucoup mesdames et messieurs d'être présents aujourd'hui. Merci à tous nos invités d'avoir répondu présent à cet échange qui, nul ne le doute, sera évidemment très riche. Je voudrais aussi remercier, bien entendu, et en tout premier lieu, Aurore Laget-Annamayer qui a organisé cette conférence, qui est la deuxième en fait d'une série. Mais Claudie Boiteau a dû le rappeler il y a 2 minutes, puisque j'avais quelques minutes de retard. Je voudrais aussi remercier effectivement l'équipe de la chaire et l'équipe du CR2D, et en particulier pour ce qui concerne la chaire Marie-Hélène Caïticoli, qui a consacré beaucoup d'énergie à l'organisation de ce colloque. Je voudrais aussi remercier les partenaires de la chaire, la SNCF, Bonafide, qui ont aussi beaucoup œuvré à l'organisation de ce colloque. Et puis un special thanks, comme on dit, à un des partenaires du club qui a été un pilier de l'organisation de ce colloque, qui est l'autorité de régulation des transports, qui nous a permis de réunir ce matin un grand nombre de partenaires, enfin d'autres régulateurs européens. Alors, je vais essayer de conserver, enfin d'être très très court dans mon propos liminaire, et je ne vais pas revenir en fait sur le détail évidemment de la spécificité du secteur ferroviaire et des spécificités de la libéralisation de ce secteur, mais je voudrais quand même, en tant qu'économiste, en quelque sorte, rappeler un peu la perspective un peu dans laquelle on doit comprendre la libéralisation et essayer de l'interpréter. Les objectifs de la libéralisation, ce n'est pas du tout d'instaurer de la concurrence sauvage, comme on le lit parfois dans certaines tribunes dans la presse, mais une concurrence organisée qui essaye d'obtenir les avantages du marché sans ses principaux inconvénients. Quels sont les avantages du marché ? C'est une stimulation des acteurs, une stimulation à l'efficacité, une écoute de la demande et une capacité aussi d'innovation. Et puis, pourquoi on n'a pas pourquoi on ne va pas vers des marchés avec de la concurrence sauvage ? Parce que, en particulier dans le secteur du transport, mais ça concerne aussi d'autres secteurs qui ont fait l'objet de libéralisation, il y a un rôle prépondérant évident des autorités organisatrices de transport. Et en fait, l'intérêt de la libéralisation pour ces autorités organisatrices de transport, quelles qu'elles soient au niveau national, régional, etc., urbain, c'est qu'elles peuvent faire des choix mieux informés. Et c'est un des objectifs de la libéralisation, de permettre une plus grande transparence des marchés, des coûts, du rapport entre l'offre et la demande, une plus grande transparence aussi de ce qui doit être financé finalement par le contribuable et de ce qui doit être financé par les usagers. Parce qu'on a une plus grande transparence des coûts et qu'on sait mieux dans les coûts ce qui est lié par exemple à effectivement par exemple des compromis sociaux qui peuvent être tout à fait légitimes mais qui ne doivent pas nécessairement être financés par les usagers, mais par les contribuables, par exemple, parce qu'ils résultent effectivement d'accords de solidarité nationale ou régionale d'ailleurs, mais pas forcément de solidarité entre les usagers et un certain nombre de parties prenantes. Par ailleurs, lorsqu'on essaye d'évaluer la libéralisation, il ne faut pas s'en tenir en fait à ce à quoi parfois on s'en tient dans la presse, c'est-à-dire savoir si les trains sont plus en retard ou plus à l'heure qu'avant, ou s'il y a une baisse des tarifs pour les usagers. En fait, on vise avant tout une baisse, enfin une amélioration du rapport qualité sur coût en général, d'une manière générale, avec une compréhension relativement large de la qualité. La qualité, c'est pas simplement, évidemment, la ponctualité des trains, pour prendre cet exemple-là, mais c'est aussi, par exemple, la capacité d'interconnexion entre modes de transport. D'une manière plus générale, c'est aussi la capacité de répondre à une demande des usagers. Les usagers sont divers, ils peuvent avoir des besoins divers, et donc une offre monoproduit ne répond pas forcément à ces besoins. Donc il faut envisager en fait une amélioration de la qualité au sens large. Il faut aussi, un des objectifs de la libéralisation, c'est de permettre des investissements importants et de l'innovation. Claudie Boiteau vient de le rappeler, c'est une industrie de coût fixe avec des investissements importants, et sans ces investissements, eh bien, pas de service. Et par ailleurs, je voudrais rappeler qu'un des éléments de la libéralisation, consiste effectivement à remettre en cause l'organisation verticalement intégrée de monopoles historiques. Alors là aussi, il faut aussi se garder d'une approche trop naïve qui consisterait à penser que parce qu'on va effectivement constituer une multitude d'entités, ça va moins bien marcher parce qu'il y aura des coûts de coordination plus importants. En fait, il y a des gains potentiels à la déintégration, comme on dit en économie, à la déintégration verticale, donc lorsqu'on sépare les différents éléments de la chaîne de valeur. Par exemple, en fait, la déintégration, ça permet de la flexibilité, ça permet de la spécialisation d'une partie des fournisseurs de services, et ça permet éventuellement des gains en efficacité. Si vous regardez dans des secteurs qui ne sont absolument pas régulés, ou dérégulés ou libéralisés, peu importe les expressions, regardez par exemple les firmes multinationales, l'évolution de leur organisation au cours du temps. Eh bien, les firmes multinationales, quand les chaînes de valeur ne sont pas organisées à l'international, elles intègrent, elles créent des chaînes de valeur intégrées, et puis quand dans les pays et les différents pays où elles opèrent, en fait, les capacités de gestion, les capacités industrielles sont là, elles ont souvent intérêt à déintégrer, en fait, à faire appel à des sous-traitants, maintenant que la capacité de sous-traitance est là, et éventuellement, elles gagnent en efficacité, en flexibilité. Et donc, il ne faut pas nécessairement concevoir la déintégration verticale comme une perte d'efficacité. Pour ce qui concerne la déintégration horizontale, eh bien, le fait que la demande n'est pas face à un monopole homogène, ça permet effectivement de différencier les offres de services, de les adapter éventuellement à une demande plurielle, comme je l'ai évoqué tout à l'heure. Et dans tout ça, il ne faut pas oublier le rôle clé des investisseurs que j'ai mentionné, qui permettent effectivement le développement de nouvelles capacités, qui sont des capacités en fait qui s'ajoutent aux capacités existantes, ou qui sont des capacités complémentaires, qui, par exemple, dans des modes de transport complémentaires du mode de transport ferroviaire, puisqu'il s'agit de ça aujourd'hui. Alors évidemment, il y a des problèmes de transition. Quand on passe d'un modèle verticalement intégré, monopolistique, etc., à de nouveaux modèles. Il faut d'abord organiser des marchés, effectivement, et ces marchés sont très complexes, et donc ça pose des problèmes d'organisation des marchés. C'est le rôle de l'ART en France, c'est le rôle des régulateurs de participer à l'organisation de ces marchés, et évidemment, les marchés ne se font pas en un jour. Si vous regardez comment les marchés historiquement se construisent, ça prend parfois des dizaines d'années, parfois même plus longtemps. Ils évoluent puisque les technologies évoluent, etc., etc. Et donc, nécessairement, il y a des problèmes d'ajustement. Et donc, il ne faut pas voir au moindre des ajustements une remise en cause du modèle et de la politique. Il faut analyser, en fait, la capacité qu'a le régulateur, la capacité qu'ont les opérateurs à créer des marchés efficaces qui tiennent compte, effectivement, des spécificités de chaque fonctionnalité, de chaque sous-élément de la chaîne de valeur, en l'occurrence, encore une fois, du transport ferroviaire. Et puis, par ailleurs, il faut mettre en place des nouvelles structures organisationnelles dans les organisations qui agissent sur ces marchés. C'est vrai de l'opérateur historique, c'est vrai aussi des opérateurs, des nouveaux entrants. Ils doivent développer de nouvelles capacités, ça fait appel à des nouvelles capacités managériales, etc. etc. Et donc forcément, il va falloir tenir compte en fait, des délais d'ajustement. Et donc effectivement, alors la libéralisation en France est récente pour le transport de voyageurs, mais la trajectoire est connue depuis longtemps. Et effectivement, l'opérateur historique doit s'adapter. Il l'a déjà beaucoup fait. Et on peut attendre qu'ils continuent à le faire. Et puis les nouveaux opérateurs, effectivement, vont créer des nouvelles capacités, des nouvelles compétences. Et ce n'est que dans le long terme qu'on pourra juger de l'efficacité globale de cette politique. Effectivement, il est toujours intéressant de regarder ce que font nos voisins qui parfois ont pris un peu d'avance sur ces politiques de libéralisation pour comprendre quelles sont en fait les bonnes tactiques d'ajustement, les bonnes stratégies de développement pour réaliser en fait cette libéralisation et donc et la réussir. Pour le plus grand bien, en fait, à la fois des usagers, des citoyens, grâce à cette meilleure transparence qu'on doit avoir à la fin, et ce qui n'exclut pas, en fait, effectivement, hein, qu'il y ait des débats sur des options. Est-ce que c'est plus le contribuable, plus l'utilisateur qui doit financer tel ou tel aspect du service, etc. Les débats sont là, il y a une arène politique pour les mener, et puis après, effectivement, aux opérateurs, à l'autorité de régulation de mettre en place les structures, enfin les structures de marché, les structures organisationnelles qui permettent de répondre aux priorités qui ont été choisies collectivement par la collectivité selon les procédures les plus légitimes possibles, on l'espère. Eh bien, c'est tout l'objet de nos débats d'aujourd'hui, et donc je vous remercie à nouveau d'avoir accepté de participer à nos échanges, et pour ma part, je suis très, très, très impatient de vous écouter. Et donc, je vous laisse la parole.
Merci. Chers collègues, chers amis, chers acteurs du secteur ferroviaire, bonjour à tous et bienvenue dans cette université Paris-Dauphine-PSL. C'est un réel plaisir pour moi de vous accueillir dans cette belle salle Raymond Aron et d'introduire rapidement ce colloque sur l'ouverture à la concurrence du transport ferroviaire de voyageurs en Europe. Now I will switch into English. I'm very pleased and honored that such prestigious academics and actors of the railway sector are gathered here today. Firstly, I would particularly like to express my gratitude to my colleague and friend Claudie Boiteau, who made this conference possible and supported me from the beginning of this large-scale project. I could not have organized this conference without her tremendous help. I would also thank the Dauphine Research Center and her director for his financial support, along with the Governance and Regulation Chair and his director, Professor Éric Brousseau. My personal thanks go finally to Marie-Hélène Caici-Colli, Deputy Manager of the Chair, for our fruitful exchanges throughout the preparation, and Éric Figueroa, Assistant of our Law Research Center, for his valuable logistical help. This conference, as Claudie Boiteau has already said, is part of a series of conferences on the railway sector, which I initiated in 2021. The first one was held at the University of Rouen, Normandy, and was focused on the French case. The objective of this second conference is to broaden the study to Europe by giving it a comparative perspective. That's why, in order to illustrate the program, no, if I can have the painting, no, the illustration just disappeared. That's why, in order to illustrate the program, I chose a painting from Henri Ottman, the Luxembourg station in Brussels in 1903, exhibited at the Musée d'Orsay, a former train station in Paris. This seems to me an appropriate symbol for a conference, for our conference, as the liberalization process was driven by Brussels as the capital of the EU, whilst Luxembourg, where the Court of Justice of the EU is located, appears as the perfect starting point for a study on litigation. Indeed, artistic representations of railways have always inspired painters, such as Monet, with his paintings of La Gare Saint-Lazare, which illustrate my former conference, filmmakers or writers. With regard, for the last one, I would like to give one more example, but the last one I promise. La Modification of Michel Butor, a famous novel in France, which tells the story of a character's transformation during a train journey between Paris and Rome in 1957, precisely the year of the Treaty of Rome. But now I must return to less artistic reality. The railway sector was actually one of the last network sectors to be covered by EU law. The opening up to competition was initiated more than 30 years ago in 1991 with the first railway package and was followed by several packages. As a matter of fact, competition has been gradually introduced and as an instrument of integration in the provision of both freight and passenger services. For this purpose, the most fundamental objective of the Directive 2012-34, called the Recast Directive, establishing a single European railway area, is to promote competition in the provision of rail transport services by ensuring non-discriminatory access to railway infrastructure. Finally, the fourth railway package, adopted in December 2016, has fully completed the opening process. We can now say, I think, that the EU regulatory framework has reached maturity, as 7 years after its adoption, this directive has been implemented in the member states. Thus, France, for example, with the new Rail Pact of June 2018, was one of the last member states to have opened up its domestic passenger transport services to competition, and with a different timetable between open access, commercial services, and PSO services. This after the opening up of international freight in 2003, domestic freight in January 2007, and international rail passenger services in 2009. It is therefore a perfect moment for a conference on this topic, as competition in passenger services is emerging, or should emerge, even in the latecomers member states. It's time not only to evaluate this process, but also, I think, to highlight the new challenge of sustainable mobility in line with the European Green Deal ambition. In order to have an overview of the diversity of situations in Europe about domestic rail passenger transport, I made the choice to focus on countries which are emblematic of this movement. This is the case of United Kingdom, which launched the movement in 1993, Germany and Austria, Italy and Spain. It's interesting for France, which is now seeing the first changes brought by the competition, to have an assessment of what has happened in the other member states. As a result, this conference is a way to gather an interesting feedback of experiences from various players of the sector, to feed our reflection on the strengths and weaknesses of competition. One day won't be enough to deal with all these issues. That's why I've chosen to focus on two major topics. In the morning, is devoted to the legal framework of the opening to competition in each of the selected countries and its evaluation by academics and various actors represented today. And I thank all the persons who are there today. In the afternoon, we will study the disputes arising at both the national and the European level linked to these evolutions. So as you can see, it's quite an ambitious program for today. To finish, I would like to thank again the speakers for coming today and for the rich preliminary exchanges that we had ahead of this conference. After this introduction, our day is on track, and without competition between us, we will start our work. Thank you very much. After my introductory remarks, it is my honor to chair the first panel dedicated to the opening up to competition through the lens of the sector's organization. The aim is to highlight the specific features of each state, both from the point of view of method of opening up, open access versus conventional system, and the method of organizing the sector, in particular, maybe, the status of the infrastructure manager. I'm very pleased to welcome Tony Prosser, my colleague Tony Prosser, Professor Emeritus of Law at the University of Bristol, Monica Delsignore, Professor at the University of Milano, Bicocca, Christian Schneider, Partner at BPV Hügel, and Juan Montero, Professor at the University UNED of Madrid. It's quite important to stick the 15 minutes schedule of the presentation in order to leave room for the Q&A session. Thank you in advance for that. I know that you have 5 minutes more. Thank you, Tony. For now, I'm giving the floor to Professor Tony Prosser.
Well, thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to return here to Dauphine, and I'd particularly like to thank Claudie and Aurore for their excellent organization of this event and for the very warm welcome that they always offer to me. I will be speaking in English because my French is of such a quality that I think it would be extremely annoying to French ears if I were attempting to do it. The UK was a pioneer in rail privatization, but the model adopted was very different from that in other European states. Markets liberalized. Even pre-Brexit, the 2016 directive would not have made any big changes in the UK. The infrastructure is an infrastructure operator is an independent publicly owned company, Network Rail. However, there's only a limited role for open access passenger services, by which I mean services which compete with the dominant operator. Yeah, that's the right slide, thank you. And which enter the market. At least until recently, they represented less than 1% of passenger miles and have been difficult to organize in many areas because of the highly congested nature of some parts of the rail infrastructure. We'll hear more about that later today. Interestingly, in the planned reforms that were announced in 2021, there was little discussion of them, so they look very unlikely to be a major development in the future. Now, the key characteristic of the UK experience has firstly been the use of independent regulation, which I'll say more about this afternoon, carried out through the ORR, the Office of Rail and Road, and the use until recently of franchising, which offered competition for the market rather than competition in the market, in which companies would bid for groups of services and would in principle take the revenue risk for this. In other words, if revenue fell, the company would bear the loss. If it rose because the company was efficient or very attractive to consumers, the company would take the benefits. Now, independent regulation, in my view, has been broadly successful. Franchising was a failure, as is now, I think, universally admitted, even by at least the Johnson government. Say more about that later. So what were the problems of franchising? The first was limited competition. The idea was that there would be plenty of new entrants, entrepreneurialism would be strong. This didn't happen. Since 2012, 2/3 of the franchises were awarded without competition, usually as an extension of an existing franchise. And rather than a lot of new entrants, there was a major role for other state-owned European rail operators. Trenitalia, for example, recently, and others. So that was unexpected, I think, and resulted in a system that did not unleash the entrepreneurialism that was planned. Secondly, the franchises were over-specified. The franchise agreements normally are of around 1,000 pages and have actually resulted in much greater control over the companies than was the case when the companies were publicly owned. Contract is much more detailed than ownership as a means of government influence. Thirdly, transfer of revenue risk was hugely over-optimistic. Much risk is actually due to changes in the national economy, not changes in the performance of the company providing the services. And in addition, there was some very over-optimistic bidding by bidders for franchises. And several simply withdrew from the market, being replaced in theory temporarily by a publicly owned operator of last resort, which is currently in place for 5 operators. And these have worked reasonably well, partly because the public arrangements here have involved avoiding the detailed specifications of the franchise contracts. Most fundamentally of all, though, the franchising arrangements resulted in fragmentation of the system and a lack of communication and trust between different parts of it. For example, the fares system became highly complex. The national timetabling system collapsed in 2018. And anyway, COVID-19 meant the end of franchising because of the collapse of revenue, and they were replaced by management contracts with operators paid a fixed fee with a performance fee in addition. The government, let's move on to another slide. Yep. The government announced plans for reform in May 2021 in the form of the William Shapps White Paper, which was issued by the government. And it proposed a new public sector organisation, Great British Railways, to act as a guiding mind for the system, to bring all aspects of the system together. It would take over responsibility for infrastructure and systems functions, such as timetabling. It would incorporate the infrastructure operator network rail. Importantly, it would remain subject to independent regulation by the ORR, and that would continue to take access systems, though there would be some reforms in the way this was done. It didn't suggest any big increase in open access competition, but what it's proposed was that the new Great British Railways would issue concessions to private operators in the form of passenger rail contracts with limited transfer of risk. They would essentially be management contracts with fixed fees. And this would not transfer revenue risk to operators from the public sector. Okay, that was in 2021, progress on implementation has been very slow. The creation of the new Great British Railways as an arm's length body would require fresh legislation. And this was originally in the Transport Bill, but it was removed from the Transport Bill because of a shortage of parliamentary time and the need to respond to other crises in the UK, particularly energy price increases and the cost of living crisis. Frankly, I think what has happened here is that the post-Brexit political chaos in the UK has paralysed policy reform. We've had 3 separate prime ministers in the second half of last year, 3 separate transport ministers, 3 separate rail ministers. You can't make clear policy in those conditions. At the moment, the Labour Party is over 20 points ahead in the polls, and there will be a general election in less than 2 years. Labour Party policy is to adopt, I think, something a bit closer to the proposed reforms, but with greater powers for regional and local governments and taking back privately run services into the public sector as contracts expire. Meanwhile, there have been major problems of service delivery. There have been a regular series of strikes by several different unions, effectively paralysing the system on strike days. Today is a strike day, therefore there are no trains running in England as a result of the strikes. The strikes have been concerned with pay demands and demands from the other side, from the employer, for efficiency improvements. A major difficulty has been ambiguity about the role of government. The government clearly has played a role in the talks with the trade unions, but has been reluctant to admit publicly what its role is. And again, this has, I think, paralysed the process, though there may be some progress at the moment. There has also been some major difficulties. Sorry, I should be on the next slide. Where are we? Yeah, sorry, that's there. Of service delivery. Probably our most important long-distance line is the West Coast Line from London to Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, run by Avanti West Coast. It's owned by the main private sector operator, First Group, which owns 70%, and Trenitalia, which issues 30%. And last August, it made sudden, major service cuts. For example, the key Manchester to London service was reduced from 3 trains an hour to 1 train an hour. And up to 20% of services that should have run were cancelled. And 2 reasons for this: shortage of drivers caused by under-recruitment of drivers, and secondly, a lack of goodwill because of poor industrial relations, which meant that it was difficult to get overtime carried out by workers. It's been given a 6-month contract to sort things out, but similar problems have occurred in another contract, which is run by First Group, the Trans-Pennine contract. So there have been some major problems of service delivery. Okay, so that's the situation. It's not encouraging. My own view is that the proposals in the William Schaap's white paper were a good way forward, and I think almost everyone has accepted that, but there are difficulties of implementation. So I'll conclude by a few lessons that can be drawn from this. The first one is that fragmentation of the system and lack of coordination in it was a major problem, and that underlay the proposals in the white paper, but it's still unclear how that will be resolved. And I'll say a bit more about it when I speak again this afternoon. Secondly, over-specification of service requirements undermined trust, undermined the ability to innovate, and also made monitoring more difficult, monitoring of performance. Too much detail was specified to make it possible to monitor in the round. And I think the final lesson, and the most basic one, is that rail is essentially a system. it requires communication and trust between different operators, rather than detailed rules, incentives, and adversary relationships. Again, that's something which I'll say a bit more about next in my afternoon presentation. I think I'm exactly on 15 minutes, so I'll conclude at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for your extremely interesting presentation, and I'm sure it will fill the debate for after the other presentation. So now I'm giving the floor to Monica Delsignore. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonjour, je suis très honorée de l'invitation à participer à cette conférence du professeur Aurore et Claudie, que je vous remercie également pour le chaleureux accueil. Malheureusement, depuis que mon français est élémentaire, je m'excuse au présent, ma conversation sera en anglais. I think I have some slides as well. First of all, I need some preliminary remarks in order even to let you understand better my conclusion. And first of all, I think that, as Aurore pointed out in her brief presentation, when we speak rail, we need to understand which is the new horizon we are discussing about. And of course, rail is not only an issue of competition, but is one of the most sustainable transport modes we have, and therefore it plays a key role in the EU becoming climate neutral by 2050. And therefore, in this context, it should be vital that the legislation establishing the single European railway area is effectively applied. And actually, from the very beginning, even considering the previous packages, the idea and the European choice has been in favor of competition through the separation of the infrastructure manager on one side and the railway undertaking on the other side. So the idea was of a free-pole system in which we had the state and the regulator, and then we had the railway undertaking companies competing and the infrastructure manager. But because as in most member states, the infrastructure manager and the national railway undertaking were just but a single entity, in the end, the European policy had to find a compromise solution, considering that separation is possible even in the holding structure. So we just skip so that I stay in my 15 minutes, and it's time to move to the Italian experience. So before the fourth package, and so even considering just the third package, the Italian experience has been very successfully. Actually, in Italy, the train transport has been liberalized quite early in 2001, and indeed, the rail liberalization of the Italian high-speed network is considered by many as a really successful example of competition in the rail market. So today, both Italo, which is actually the name of the company, is Nuovo Trasporto Viaggiatori, but Italo is the name of the train, and so is a private company, a private operator. You can see it in the bottom, and Frecciarossa, which is the name of the train of the public operator, who is Trenitalia in Italy, are using their more than a decade experience to replicate this model outside our national borders. And it must be said that the Italian high-speed trains have in some way even revolutionized the people's lifestyles and mobility in Italy, because the competition introduced by the new entrant Italo just has led to more capacity with increased frequencies, especially because of the strategies of these last 5 years period and lower prices. It has been estimated a reduction of the 30% of the price and better services for users. Nevertheless, as many other member states, Italy was part of the infringement procedure started by the Commission in 2008 on the correct implementation of railway packages, and in October 2013, the Court of Justice declared Italy was failing to ensure the independence of the infrastructure manager with regard to the setting of charges for access to the infrastructure, because of the role played by the ministry in the administrative procedure. So I think it's important to remember that this Court of Justice jurisprudence is at the basis, and was at the basis of the adoption of the fourth package, which still in the end chose a compromise solution, as I was saying at the beginning, as it did not require full separation between railway undertakings and infrastructure manager, as many were expecting. So the idea of creating this new European railway area we're discussing today about, of course, is based on two different pillars. Actually, the technical pillar do have an impact on competition, because even the decision of the standards can in some way limit the access to the market. But I think that the most relevant legal issues, even in the Italian framework, have to do with the market pillar. I will try to show you some criticism considering three different aspects. The first one is what I call the ongoing conflict of interest, which still can exist within the Italian vertical integrated model. The second one is the existing difficulties in introducing a fair competition deriving from the coexistence of an open access infrastructure on one side and public services contracts together. And then the last one point is what I call the insufficient power of the Transport Regulatory Authority in Italy. So, moving from the first point, of course, as we know, the directive of 2016 still admits the holding company model, and vertical integration is permitted, but with a set of appropriate safeguards to assure the impartiality of the infrastructure managers as regards the essential function, traffic management, and maintenance plans. So this sort and all these safeguards together are called as the Chinese wall arrangements that stays within the group. In Italy, as you can see by the image, the group is as a holding, which is Ferrovie dello Stato Italiano, which actually was a public entity, and in 1992 was transformed in a public company, actually a joint stock corporation totally owned by the Ministry of Economy and Finance. Then, since 1996, the company went through a process of restructuration, and in 2011, we came to the holding company we have today. In this vertically integrated infrastructure, you see that the infrastructure manager, which is Rete Ferroviaria Italiana, RFI, is a subsidiary of the holding company. And in the same group, we find Trenitalia, you see it on the right, after the RFI, which is the main national and even regional railway company. So if we look to the prescribed safeguards, the appropriate safeguards which are asked by the directive. Actually, the Italian legislation, which is a decree of 2015, as then implemented and updated, just fully copies the prescriptions of the directive. And the requirement, which is stated in the directive, is the absence of decisive influence by the other legal entities, of course, on the decisions taken by the infrastructure manager. And I think that this expression of decisive influence recalls an ambiguous terminology which may leave and admit as legitimate opportunistic behavior in advantage or benefit of Trenitalia by RFI. As well, if we look at financial transparency provisions, again, the Italian provisions are just the same as the one of the directive. This should help concerning the use of cross-subsidies and the distinction in the use of public funding by the infrastructure manager and the railway undertaking, so RFI and Trenitalia, which are in the same group. But the absence of a clear distinction in the activity of the railway undertaking Trenitalia concerning business in the market on one side and business for the market or public service activities on the other represent another problematic issue. So we move to the second point, which I call the existing difficulties of a fair competition deriving from the coexistence of an open access infrastructure and public services contracts. So if we look at the access to infrastructure, in Italy we have the RFI, which is of course the infrastructure manager, which every year publishes what is called in Italian prospetto informativo rete, which is the network statements to inform the railway undertakings of the criteria, the procedure, the methods, and the deadlines for allocating infrastructure capacity. And in the drafting of the statements, the Transport Regulatory Authority plays an important role today, replacing the ministry and the system which has been condemned by the Court of Justice, as I said before. So this new, I mean quite new because it was established in 2011, the Transport Authority in Italy. So this authority should be able to introduce new stringent parameters in order to open the infrastructure to new undertaking. And the Transport Regulatory Authority intervene in the supply of public services. Specifically, the law provides that the authority, also taking into account the relevant economic analysis, having ascertained that the economic equilibrium of the public service contract is compromised, shall indicate any limitation which would make it possible to fulfill the condition for granting the right of access to the new operator. But then the law goes further and is then RFI that may require the railway undertaking to pay appropriate, transparent, and non-discriminatory compensation charge, which have been autonomously determined by RFI after the opinion of the Transport Regulatory Authority. And moreover, coming to the third point, as a general rule, is the task of the authority to ensure fair and non-discriminatory access conditions, and therefore the authority identifies the criteria for the determination of charges by the infrastructure manager. But again, the law provides that tariff is finally set by the infrastructure manager under the supervision of the Ministry of Transport. So, in conclusion, I think that by looking at the Italian discipline, but more generally at the substance of the full European railway package, we can say that, first of all, liberalization immediately establishes a regime of economic freedom and formal equality, but the benefits of this measure differ over time, depending on complex transformation, and there is no guarantee that they will be realized effectively. then access regulation alone is often not sufficient to prevent opportunistic or discriminatory behavior of the infrastructure manager, where it is part of a group that is also active in upstream or downstream segments providing transport services with its own subsidiary. The holding structure, allowed in European law, guarantees formal independence, since the group entities have legal personality and they are distinct structure. But concerns remain with regards to effective independence and impartiality in decision-making, and therefore the role of the Transport Authority must be enhanced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I noticed that we have already a few words that are coming, like transparency, cooperation, so I imagine the debate will be interesting around these terms. And now I'm giving the floor to Christian Schneider. Thank you very much for the German and Austrian model.
Oui, tout d'abord, merci bien. Ok. Tout d'abord, merci bien pour l'invitation. C'est déjà la deuxième fois que je suis ici en tant qu'intervenant. And now let's switch to English. There should be a presentation. The very outset, I would like to give you a market overview of the Austrian and the German railway, passenger railway markets. And despite of both countries being German-speaking, the market structure is very different. In Austria, ÖBB Personenverkehr AG, that's the passenger traffic branch of Austrian Federal Railways, has a market share of plus 90%, and there are some private railway companies operating on their private infrastructure. There are only two relevant exceptions from that. The one is Westbahn, where SNCF is a shareholder with a 17.4% shareholding. They are operating from Vienna to the west of Austria, and there's RegioJet, that's a Czech company operating between Prague, Vienna, and some trains continue to Budapest. In Germany, the situation is totally different. In Germany, you have Deutsche Bahn as the incumbent, and in regional services, they have a market share of some 60%, but there's also a large number of private operators, 33% market share in 2020. When it comes to long-distance services, there's a very high market share of Deutsche Bahn, but there are also some long-distance services operated by other operators. There's Flixtrain. You will find the network on the next slide. There is Thalys, and there is Swedish Railways, and there are also some seasonal night trains. Whether that regime is open access or franchising, I will explain afterwards when I will speak about the finances. Well, legal sources also quite interesting. In Austria, all is regulated by one law, the Railways Act, and in Germany you have the General Railway Act on the one hand, and you have an act on railway regulation, the Eisenbahnregulierungsgesetz, which deals with specific regulatory issues such as unbundling charges, access to infrastructure, and also the organization of the regulatory authority. At this place, I would elaborate a little bit about unbundling in separation between infrastructure and operation. Here, both Austria and Germany follow the same concept, which means the holding concept that both the infrastructure manager and both the operating branch are within the same holding structure. There had been treaty infringement proceedings in 2008 also against Austria and Germany. In those proceedings, the European Commission had attempted to implement the interpretation of the unbundling regime in the electricity and the gas sector into the railway regime, but the European Commission failed before the ECJ. Well, regarding licensing, the criteria of the directive on the single European railway area were both implemented in Austria and in Germany, and there is some margin of discretion regarding the detailed licensing criteria, because in that regard the directive is quite vague, but due to mutual recognition that's not the biggest problem. In Germany, I would say there is a problem that is detrimental to competition, because there you have an irrefutable assumption that companies that are state-owned or owned by regional authorities fulfill the licensing criteria without proof. That, in my view, is discriminatory. Well, capacity rights and access. Both in Austria and Germany, the relevant provisions of the directive had been implemented quite literally, but there are some national particularities that at least partly have a negative impact on competition. In Austria, we have and also in Germany, liberalization had been fully achieved before the current directive, before the recast, and before the amendment in 2016. However, Austria makes use of Article 11 of Directive 2012-34 EU regarding the possibility to restrict the pickup and the set down of passengers in order to assure the economic equilibrium of PSO contract. That's actually the most important exemption from full access in the field of passenger services. In Germany, Germany did not invoke that provision, and in Austria that has also already had some negative impact, because according to that provision, an applicant for capacity right has to inform the regular body 18 months in advance, which means that it's rather difficult to implement new services. And there's also a practical case in Austria where that had gained importance. Westbahn, the competitor on the most important passenger railway line in Austria from Vienna to the west of Austria, that has already been operating between Vienna and Salzburg, wanted to extend its services to Innsbruck. And they failed to notify that 18 months in advance. So at first place, Austrian Federal Railways complained with the regulator, but they achieved a settlement so that in reality, luckily, that 18-month period did not play a role. Then also one possible obstacle to competition in Austria, that's a provision in the Railway Act, according to which the infrastructure manager may grant priority of access to clock face timetable trains at junction stations. That also favors Austrian Federal Railways. Well, in Germany, there's another issue regarding access. There's a particular regime for the use of platforms in passenger stations. That regime is not in line with EU law, because there's a rather recent judgment by the ECJ saying that the regime regarding platforms is part of the minimum access package to some extent. Well, next slide, infrastructure and service charges. Here both Austria and Germany have fully implemented the European regime, which says that with some exemptions, charges have to be based on the social marginal cost principle. Also quite interesting, in the past there had been some problems with the charges for traction current, because there had been cross subsidies between the traction current network and the delivery of electricity, but that now has been solved, and there have to be separated bills for use of infrastructure and for the delivery of currents. There are some national particularities, both in Austria and, well, mainly in Germany. In Germany, you have incentive-based regulation of network charges, incentive-based regulations, you know, from the electricity and also from the telecom market. In my view, that's not in line with the directive, because in my view, the directive is exhaustive on the charging principles. And then you also have a link between PSO financing and infrastructure charging, also not foreseen by the directive and possibly discriminating to open access operators. So that was actually also a keyword, public service obligations, because, as you know, most railway passenger services normally don't earn their cost, which in reality means that they have to rely on subsidies. And after full liberalization of the access, actually the public service obligation regime is key on whether competition may work or not. Here, the regimes in Germany and in Austria differ enormously. In Austria, well, first of all in Germany, long-distance passenger services are generally provided on a commercial basis, and subsidies are limited to local and regional services, and there's a particular act on that. It's the Regionalisierungsgesetz, and in general, public service obligations are awarded by means of tenders, and in order to promote competition, rolling stock is very often purchased by the contracting authorities and led to the operators. In Austria, as I've already said, the system is totally different. Both local and regional services on the one hand, and also long-distance services, are subject to public service obligations. There is only one relevant exception. That's the Vienna to Salzburg line, where Austrian Federal Railways faces competition by Westbahn. And furthermore, Austria also invoked one very important transitional provision in the public service obligation regulation of the EU. In Austria, we have the so-called GWL Vertrag, Contract on Public Service Obligations. That's something like the contracts with 1,000 pages Tony Prosser mentioned before. And there's, as I said, a transitional provision that until end of 2019, member states were entitled to award such contracts without tender. The relevant date for the award was, I think, in December 2019. And in Austria, that contract was awarded without tender in November 2019 for 10 years. So open access, yes or not? Private operators normally operate as open access operators because they normally don't get any compensation under the PSO regime. There are only few exemptions. There's one for certain tariffs within transport associations, Verkehrsverbünde in German, and there's also the so-called Klimaticket, the climate ticket. So there you have the right, if you pay 1,100 euro, you may travel with all public transport within entire Austria for your 1 year. There's something like the 49 euro ticket you plan in Germany. And since that ticket has the character of a general rule within the meaning of the PSO regulations, also private operators are entitled to compensation. Well, my last slide, and I think I'm within the time frame, is further obstacles to competition. I would say further obstacles to competition also result from divergent security provisions in different countries. Here I brought you as an example that there's no grandfathering of authorizations of rolling stock. That has particular importance for passenger services between Austria and Italy, because in Italy they implemented a tunnel evacuation concept with particular fireproof standards for coaches that are not attained by already existing coaches. And in the past, one further big problem was actually vehicle authorization. That even applied between Austria and Germany, where the railway systems had been almost fully interoperable even before the enactment of the interoperability directives by the EU. But nevertheless, there had been some problems. So I will bring you at the very end a funny case. I know that from an operation manager of an Austrian railway undertaking. They wanted to buy diesel locos in Germany that had gained full authorization by the German Eisenbahnbundesamt, the licensing authority. But in Austria, they were denied authorization on grounds that the dashboard for the driver didn't have rounded corners, but had edged corners, and the denial was based on occupational safety reasons. So mutual recognition, you know that principle from the EU, that does not really work in Austria, or hasn't worked for the time being. It's easier because we have that devolution of competencies to the European Railway Agency for vehicle authorization, at least when it comes to vehicle designated for international use. Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, which already highlights some national particularities and some remaining obstacles to competition. Thank you very much. So now, I think the last one, this is Juan Montero.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting event. But not only thank you, I would like to congratulate you, because I think it's you have pulled together really a very impressive list of speakers. I mean, everyone is here, and I think I want to congratulate you and the Dauphine group that is doing such a great work on the study of regulation. So I'm the last person in this panel. It makes things easier in the sense that we already have been exposed to the two main models of liberalization, the open access, more continental Europe model, and the British model of the franchises. In Spain, we went for the open access continental way. We implemented the RECAS directive, the 1370 regulation, in a pretty much literal form. We went for the vertical separation, so we have an infrastructure manager, we have a railway undertaking, the incumbent is separated. We created an independent regulator, we have the network statement, very heavy regulation of access to the infrastructure, prices, track access charges, non-discrimination. So we have a pretty standard legislation. But then something happened around 2018 that kind of made Spain diverge from the models that we have been presented in Italy, Austria, Germany. And we went into something that is quite different because we introduced a competition to enter the market, a tender element, which somehow could put us a little bit closer to the British model. But I would like to make it very clear. We are not in a competition for the market model. We have a picture. We have 4 different trains on the tracks. We have competition in the market. We have 3 competitors. Usually there are 4 trains here. I mean, we have 3 companies, but Renfe has 2 subsidiaries, the traditional one and then a low-cost model, which is a little bit similar to the Hügel model here in France. So we have competition in the market, despite we have this tendering element. And just a word on the network, so you understand what we are talking about. We have competition just in high-speed services. You see the map. We have a network that is very focused in Madrid, in the center of the country, and then we have corridors that go from Madrid to the coast. So just so you understand what I'm talking about, we have a corridor to Barcelona, then we have an eastern corridor that starts in Madrid, and then it spreads into different cities on the coast. We have a south corridor that, again, once it gets closer to the coast, it opens into different destinations. And then we have a north corridor. You will see a lot of yellow and red. It's under construction. So what I'm going to expose now in terms of tendering only applies to Madrid, Barcelona, east and south, not to the north corridor, not to the rest of the network. So basically, we have a big challenge in Spain. We have the largest high-speed infrastructure in Europe and the second largest in the world. But we have a very low usage of the network in terms of numbers of passengers per kilometer. And that has been the big challenge. I mean, we need more passengers. And paradoxically, we have congestion in the stations. So we have the worst of both worlds, not that many passengers and congestion when we arrive to the station. So these are the challenges that we face with liberalization. So the main scope of the liberalization process was to attract more passengers, more intensity in the use of this infrastructure that was a big investment for the country. And this is what has driven the policy, and this is also what has driven this lack of passengers, but at the same time congestion in the stations, drove the infrastructure manager, ADIF, to a very unique liberalization model. This is the specificity in Spain. There are 2 specificities I want to underline, and allowed me to underline, instead of going directly to the tender, which is usually what attracts more interest, allowed me to expose what I think it's really unique in Spain and even more important than the tendering. And it is the optimization of the timetable by the infrastructure manager. As exposed in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, basically the infrastructure manager is passively waiting for requests by railway undertakings to use the infrastructure. And then you might have congestion, you have disputes, you have problems on the use of the infrastructure. ADIF took a very different path. They decided to optimize the timetable. And just put you, it was a mathematician in the infrastructure manager who optimized all the timetables, time of departures from Madrid to the coast, to Valencia, to Barcelona, to Sevilla, what would be the optimum system to extract the best capacity, the most capacity in the network. So the infrastructure manager defined the speed at which you should travel from Madrid to Valencia, the stops, once you get to Valencia, how long you had to stay in Valencia, and then back to Madrid. In this way, the infrastructure manager managed to increase the potential number of services by 60%, which is a quite interesting figure, despite congestion in the stations. This is, I would say, the most interesting and differentiated approach in Spain, and is to have a very active infrastructure management. You have the infrastructure manager optimizing the use and reducing the potential of congestion of the network. This is quite unique to Spain, but it's not the only country where this happened. You have small examples of pre-planning, of active infrastructure management around Europe. In Italy, you have examples of pre-planning of stations. At the European level for international services, we are working on the timetable redesign, which was a lot of optimization of capacity. You have, for temporary capacity restrictions, a big issue in the railway system. You have also an evolution in terms of let's do more pre-planning to optimize. So this Spanish model is quite unique, but it's kind of part of a trend to have to rely, and let it put it very clear, to rely a little bit less on markets, just applying and every railway undertaking doing its thing, but to organize, pre-plan, and optimize a little bit more, so that railway undertakings, when they get in the market, they have an optimized and structure, which facilitates market entry. That has been a little bit, and again, it's not something that is unique. In Spain, we have taken it to the extreme, but it's something that you can find a little bit here and there around Europe. So ADIF optimized the timetable, and then they did something even more interesting. They had this round of contacts with the potential newcomers, and they identified 3 different business models. So they created, they had this optimized timetable, so they created 3 packages of track access capacity. One for kind of an incumbent model, which would be pretty much the activity of the incumbent, that would have 70% of the capacity. Then a second one with 30% of the capacity for a kind of a head-on competitor, someone who wanted to compete with the incumbent, which I would say is quite similar to what Italo has been doing in Italy, that kind of model. And then a third package with just 10% of the capacity for a low-cost operation, limited number of services, very low prices. And this, in theory, is the result of consultation with the market. Mm-hmm. The infrastructure manager defined the packages, but not based on just their own, interest or idea of how the market should work, but based on what the potential newcomers told the infrastructure manager they needed. So they created these packages, and now, again, this is very important. These packages were defined in the form of framework agreements. So the idea is, based on an element, these framework agreements that you find in European legislation, there is even an implementing regulation only for framework agreements. Framework agreements is an instrument that allows you to have capacity, to contract capacity for a long period, not on a year basis, annual basis, but for a period of maybe around 10 years. That was the period that was set in Spain. So we say, we are going to give you a package of track capacity for 10 years, allowing you this 70% of the optimized capacity. Next, so this is the active management by the infrastructure manager. The legislation is the same in Spain as in Italy, as in Austria, but the infrastructure manager played around it, used a tool in the legislation, the framework agreements, and optimized everything. The second element is that the infrastructure manager asked the railway undertakings, the potential newcomers, try to identify them. How many of them are there? I'm going to contact them. And they identified that there were 6 potential newcomers and 3 packages. There were more interested companies that available capacity. So they decided there is congestion. That's why they went for some kind of tender, a competitive process to allocate the framework agreements. And let me underline, this competitive procedure was not to grant any kind of license to enter the market. Everyone has the right to enter the market. We can have a 4th operator asking for capacity. It's just that if you want to have the 10-year framework agreements, that was put for a competitive process. Under the very same rules in the directive, in the national legislation, on the prioritization once you have requests for access to capacity. So it's a tender, but in this sense, it's a tender for the allocation of the framework agreements for capacity. Now, what is very relevant is what is the allocation criterion? What is the priority criteria to allocate the capacity? And the decision of the infrastructure manager was that the more capacity you ask for a period of 10 years, the higher the chances you have of winning the tender. And then you can see the different packages, the bidders that we had, and again, the bid was decided on how many paths over a period of 10 years you ask for. The more paths you ask for, the higher the chances. And you see what the bidder was in terms of percentage. So you have a lot of package A, the large one, Renfe, the incumbent, asked for 86% of the capacity that was put for, was made available. They won the package. Package B, the Italo model, head-on competition with the incumbent. We had Ilsa Trenitalia, Irio, so 50% owned by Trenitalia, but 50% owned by private and local investors, basically by a regional airline company. So private investor coming from another transport mode, very interesting. And they applied for 70% of the available capacity in package B. And then in package C, the small one, SNCF made an offer for 100% of the capacity. It was a small package. So these are the three entities that got into the market. They got these contracts with available capacity, ensured capacity, warranted capacity for a 10-year period. So we have these three competitors already active in the market, even if COVID had a very deep impact and delayed market entry. The first competitor, Hügel, started operations just in the Madrid-Barcelona corridor in May 2021, so it's been a while. But really competition was very limited, just one company in one corridor. And it's been only in late 2022 that Hügel expanded operations to a second corridor and that the Trenitalia participated company, Irio, started operations in the Madrid-Barcelona, Madrid-Valencia corridor. So it's very recent. They have not fully deployed operations yet. No one, and there is no newcomer active in the south corridor yet. Interestingly, they all got their own rolling stock. It was not necessary to set up any kind of regulatory scheme to ensure access to rolling stock. And we will talk a little bit more about that in the afternoon. There were not really disputes around, I don't know, service facilities, drivers, rolling stock. I mean, the fact that you pre-arrange and take a very active role in setting and preparing for liberalization has reduced conflicts afterwards. But we will talk about that a little bit more in the afternoon. Now, what happened? What has been the impact? This is very initial, because again, we had competition just in one route by one competitor, and only very recently we had more competition. But some basic ideas. First one, modal share, people going from aviation to railways, which I guess for this room, it's good news for all of us. Particularly, you see, in all the corridors, we already have a very high share of railways against aviation, around 85%, but not in Madrid-Barcelona. And as soon as we enter the market, you can see how it went up. And you have a very strong migration from air to rail. So this is, I would say, the first clear impact of liberalization, of competition. The second one is an increase in the number of passengers. Again, not a big surprise. We saw it in Italy. We've seen it pretty much everywhere where competition has been introduced. And since competition has started at different paths in the different corridors, we can compare the corridors. And what we see is that COVID recovery was much faster in the Madrid-Barcelona, where we had competition, much slower in the rest of the corridors. So I think we can assume that it helped COVID recovery. Another element, we can see that newcomers rapidly grow in terms of passengers and market share. And if you look to the Madrid-Barcelona, after a little bit more of 1 year, Hügel already has a market share of almost 30%, which is quite impressive for such a small operation, which is just 10% of the available capacity. You can see some charts, very interesting, produced by the Spanish regulator, which is starting to publish a lot of information on the results of competition. And you can see that the number of passengers overall is increasing when you add up all the different players that are active in the market. And you can see that Renfe, you can see, of course, COVID impact that makes all this analysis and the evolution of the market more complex. But you can see that Renfe has not lost a significant number of passengers when you compare back with 2019, which again is probably good news in terms of stability for the market. Prices. this is where we don't have a lot of information. It's too early to make the full analysis. What we definitely see, it's very aggressive yield management by newcomers and also the incumbent. So you see very low prices and off-peak times. When you look at, I don't know, Friday afternoon, weekends, everyone going to the coast, prices have not gone down so much. That's yield management, it would be expected. Some pieces, some small references we have. Trainline published some information on prices. They were referring to a 43% reduction in prices in Madrid, Barcelona. This is pretty much in line with what we saw in other countries. So yeah, I think it's a good reference. What is interesting is that for the routes where we don't have competition, prices didn't go down, they went up 14%. So again, you see the differences between the different areas. And just one final slide. Who wins with this process? First of all, I would say passengers win. At the end of the day, passengers, when deployment is completed, we will have 55% more services than before. So more trains on the tracks. That's more frequencies. That's good for passengers. And I don't know if 40%, but probably we will have a price reduction. That's something to be expected. Again, good for passengers. The whole process has been good for the infrastructure manager. With this, of course, 55% increase in trains, they will increase revenue. And they have calculated it. They have calculated that they will have an extra 2 billion euros in the 10-year period. Let's not forget, the criteria for the assignment was the more trucks you ask for, the higher the chances. So they somehow invited companies, maybe a little bit even to overbid. And you see that in terms of financial results for infrastructure manager. I would say that newcomers are winners in this process because this has facilitated a lot market entry. The main barrier, in my opinion, market entry in most European countries, I would say it's not rolling stock, it's not the drivers, it's the possibility to have a full timetable, right times along the day, high number of frequencies, 10, 12 at least frequencies to compete with incumbent, particularly in the business segment. In countries with a very congested network, getting these 10 tracks along the day, it's particularly difficult, it's very difficult. So this model of liberalization allows newcomers to enter the market day one with ensured capacity for 10 years. You will be able to fully deploy your model, your offer, your supply. And then what about the incumbent? I mean, there is a little bit this idea that, well, competition is good, you increase the number of passengers, everyone wins. Well, I would be a little bit more suspicious with this everyone wins. Is competition increasing the number of passengers for Renfe? I would say no. I mean, they are stable, they are not losing a lot, but I wouldn't say they are winning passengers, at least so far, or no clear increase in passengers. What about, but passengers, I mean, it's interesting, but in terms of an operation, it's not about the passengers, it's about the revenue you get out from those passengers. And of course, with the price reductions, what you can expect is a very strong reduction in revenue. So probably for the incumbent and maybe even the newcomers, this winning in terms of passengers will not transform into winning in terms of revenue and profits. And then there is a final element. Of course, these high prices in high-speed services, particularly in Madrid, Barcelona, we had artificially high prices. That's why the modal share was low, because Madrid, Barcelona was cross-subsidizing all the routes, long-distance routes that were losing money. And that's something that is being lost. So in terms of impact on the system, I mean, this is not just routes, it's a system. There is a little bit this risk of maybe you need more PSO compensations since Renfe is not getting this monopoly profit in the high-speed routes. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your really focused presentation. I was really interested about the role of the Spanish infrastructure manager, about pre-planned timetable on allocation of capacity. So this first part of the day is finished, and thank you everyone for this extremely interesting presentation, which already shows the diversity of the choices made by the various member states represented today. And this already confirms that the process of liberalization is mainly positive, but also that there are still barriers at the entry, and I think it's a good way maybe to start the debate. Donc je voudrais rappeler que vous pouvez poser des questions en français, bien sûr, et que vous êtes donc la bienvenue pour entamer ce débat. Nous avons donc une dizaine de minutes devant nous. Monsieur Otte.
Do you understand me? Yes. I have a question to Professor Pascual. According to the allocation criterion you mentioned, I took notes, and you said the allocation criterion is most intensive use of infrastructure. My question is that not a hidden grandfathering in a certain way? I fully understand that you are faced with the reality. There is the incumbent, and there are new entrants, and there are very small ones. But doesn't this produce the danger of grandfathering in a certain way, combined with a 10 years framework contract?
I mean, it would have been the case if just one package would have been put for tender. But there were 3 of them, and there was a provision that you could only win one of them. So it was somehow, there was an element of grandfathering in the sense of you have package A, the large one, which is very similar to Renfre's operation. So there was kind of an element. But then you have package B and C, which necessarily would be for newcomers. So in that sense, there was not this full protection, and there was no foreclosure of newcomers. On the contrary, there were 2 packages ensured warranted for newcomers.
I have a question regarding the 10 years length of this framework agreement. I was wondering whether it is adapted for pure player, new entrants that have no rolling stock, because all the players we can see, such as Renfe, Trenitalia, or SNCF Voyageurs, has already rolling stock. And if there are new investors that want to buy rolling stock, is it appropriate to have a 10-year duration, or something with a possibility of renewal and so on and so on?
I mean, maybe there's 2 elements into it. Since the more trucks you ask for, the higher the chances to get. Actually, you were benefiting those that already had rolling stock, because you could enter the market very fast. If you would not be able to enter the market very fast, then you would lose year 1, 2, 3, 4 of a 10-year period, and you would never win the tender, basically. Now, this is just 10 years. This is just the beginning. After the 10-year period, you could have a new framework agreement. Maybe it's not necessary. And something then very relevant that I didn't expose. Capacity has not been exhausted. According to the implementing regulation, there is we are talking 70, 30, 10, but it's 100%. But there is another package of capacity for 30% of the capacity for a 4th, a 5th player. So that ensures fulfillment of the EU legislation and the possibility for a 4th player which is building or leasing or looking for rolling stock to enter the market at a later stage. Just to be realistic, not that it's 30% of capacity, it's mostly weekends and strange times, but in theory it's possible for a 4th player to enter the market with new rolling stock that has been leased or built in this.
I have a question regarding UK. So, as you know, we are currently opening to competition in France for regional services, and there is this debate about how we should behave as the public transport authority should behave vis-à-vis a train operating company. So I've noticed that you said that over-specification of service requirement undermine trust and made monitoring more difficult, and that's really strike me as a sentence, because so I'm a consultant, I'm helping public transport authority, And this balance between trust or over-specification is not that easy to monitor, to find the right balance. So can you elaborate a little bit? And if you have a report or article, or where this idea come from?
You've hit on a absolutely central and hugely important issue here, because there is a long history, of course, in regulation studies of talking about smart regulation, talking about regulation which is responsive. And I think that was almost completely forgotten in the franchising area of rail in the UK. Because I think the assumption was that by specifying conditions, somehow that gets a result. Now, in fact, negotiation usually produces better results. I'm going to say a little bit more about this afternoon, actually, because I think that the ORR, our regulator, has got this right in a very different area, which is in relation to funding of infrastructure, where it has a role of examining the efficiency and economy of the use of funds by the infrastructure operator. And there, it's not done through detailed rules, it's done through process. It's done through an open process of debate and discussion, which produces the transparency, which was one of the key words, as you mentioned earlier, Aurore. So I think that where I'm coming from here in making that remark earlier is that perhaps something that's been forgotten in the process of liberalization is the assumption that very often rules and adversary procedures don't work as a mode of regulation. Trust is, I think, something which can be developed. I will say much more about this when I talk about disputes later. In terms of sources, I think, well, I'll refer perhaps to some of them when I do the discussion of disputes in the afternoon, because the issue of how you resolve disputes is absolutely crucial to that point that you made.
Oui, Monsieur.
So thank you. I would like to make some comments on the presentation of the German market by Professor Schneider. First, a more recent figure on the market share of competitors in the field of regional transport. It's about 40%, the latest figures. Secondly, on your estimation on the EU conformity of the legal framework in Germany as regards a platform. From my point of view, I'm talking here under control of the German regulatory authority. I think at least since the latest rail reform in 2021, it's completely conform to EU law. There's been a changement in the annexes of the Eisenbahnregulierungsgesetz. I think it's completely clear that platforms are part of the minimum access package now, without any doubt. And the third point, as regards track access charging and the regulatory regime, so all track access charges are authorized by the regulatory authority, and they would not be authorized if they would not be EU conform. So from my point of view, I don't see any non-EU conformity in this regard, but please correct me.
Okay, so first point was market share. Well, I only had the figures from 2020, and I can exclude they have changed. And regarding the platform regime, well, I know that there has been a change by the recast regarding the minimum service package, but frankly speaking, I don't understand why you think it's still Section 10A of the Railway Regulatory Act. Third point, the charges regime. There you have those particularities with incentive-based regulation and that link to Transport Association regarding PSO regimes. That, in my view, is not in line with the directive, because I understand the directive in a manner that it sets the network charging principles exhaustively. You can infer that, in my view, also from the exceptions foreseen in the directive. Those exceptions would not make any sense if they weren't exhaustive. And furthermore, also the authorization of the charges there I also see a problem because the directive only foresees a prior authorization requirement by the regulatory authority for some elements of the charging regime, but not for the charges as such. I think that has changed by the last railway package. There had been different before, but, well, that's my view.
Okay, so thank you. And my last remark would be on the presentation of Professor Montero. Just an additional remark. Also in Germany, a debate is underway as regards more offer-oriented, more active, even more active role of the German infrastructure manager. We are talking about a concept which is called a timetable for Germany. And here you will have a mixture of both elements, hopefully in the end of demand-oriented classical elements of timetabling, but also pre-configuration of timetabling, industrialization, all that. So there's a big debate underway, and probably we will have a new regime of capacity allocation in the near future.
Cher collègue Antoine Louvaris pour une question.
In his very interesting presentation, Professor Montero Pascual concluded with a balance sheet in terms of winners and losers. And I'd like to ask the question to the other speakers, what would they say in terms of winners and losers? Because after all, regulation is a matter of efficiency, and who wins? Who loses?
Okay, well, given the complexity of the UK, that's extremely difficult. There have been some ways in which passengers actually won from the system. Some of the operators were innovative. Chiltern Railways, for example, has done extremely well in introducing new services and benefited through a longer franchise than others. In terms of losers, I think that actually the government has been a user because the amount of public support for the rail network is much higher than it was before privatization and partial liberalization. So that's just a couple of examples. I could go on for a long time, but I won't.
Actually, I think that the aim of regulation is always that consumers and passengers are the winner, and so actually this should be the point. And I think that now it's not only a problem of competition, as I was saying, but I think it's much more a problem of sustainability of transport, and that's why I think that the idea of a system is not only railway, but transportation in the whole, which must be intended as a system, and therefore we should understand regulation of all the network and all the different time and mode of transportation.
Je pense que malheureusement le temps est écoulé. Ah, une dernière question alors peut-être. Avant une pause et avant d'entamer la table ronde.
Just to complete and answer the question of winners and losers, as a representative of the group of Ferrovie dello Stato in Italy, as an incumbent, the experience was very, very good. So I think that the opening up of the market in Italy was generated win-win operators. First of all, for passengers, in terms of qualities of services and the reduction of prices. For the infrastructure manager, because there was a dramatic increase of the turnover, but also for Trenitalia, because we had an increase of economic performance. We had profits that we invested in rail activities. Of course, not at the same pace of growth of the new operator, but I cannot say that we were losers.
Je vous remercie tous infiniment pour cette première partie de matinée. Je suis ravie aussi d'entendre que l'opérateur historique en Italie est ravi de la concurrence. Ça doit rassurer notre opérateur historique aussi. Et je vous convie à un café de pause avant de reprendre avec notre table ronde qui réunira les opérateurs et les régulateurs. Merci encore beaucoup. Merci.